Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. We've got a very special guest joining us on today's episode, David Hundeyan. We've had him on before to discuss, amongst many subjects in Africa. We touched on the Sahel. We touched on Nigeria and what's going on in Nigeria. Today, we're also going to be discussing Nigeria because all of the Zionists, all of the pro-Ukraine people, all of the people cheerleading for a war against Iran and Venezuela right now, they're not content yet. They need at least one more war, maybe more, but at least one more. It looks like Nigeria is going to be their next playground if they get their way. So joining me to break all of this down is Mr. Hundeyan. He is a Nigerian investigative journalist. He's done exceptional work on various issues in Nigeria. He's the author of Breaking Point, A Journalist's Quest for Salvation in Nigeria's Chaos and the Jungle. And he is the founder of West Africa Weekly. And you may have even seen his reporting in the Gray Zone. So, David, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So just to set the scene, maybe you could explain what all of this chaos is right now that's plaguing the think tanks and the war caucus in Washington, D.C., because they tell me that there's no genocide in Gaza, but there is a genocide in Nigeria. And I don't know. I have reason to hesitate and believe what they're saying if they're saying there's no genocide in Gaza.
Okay, so I guess there are three key things to understand about this issue. And it's best to sort of start from the beginning. So over the past decade and some, maybe decade and a half, there's been an escalating pattern of violence in Nigeria, particularly in the Middle Belt and the northern part of Nigeria. Now, this violence, as you know, a lot of it has been carried out by groups professing to be Islamists. So groups like Boko Haram, groups like the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, groups like Ansaru, JNIM, and other groups like that. And while these attacks obviously have targeted people indiscriminately, because I think it's also important to point out that statistically more Muslims than Christians have actually died in these attacks. However, being that these are parts of the country which tend to be more populated by Muslims anyway, there is data showing that the Christians or the animists or other people who are affected by these attacks, it has tended to be somewhat disproportionate. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is that in 2019, I was part of a research team that actually worked on documenting some of this violence. So we traveled to parts of northern Nigeria where some of these attacks are taking place. We interviewed survivors, we got hold of death certificates and records and all of this stuff. And we put together a report which was published in 2020. That report was called Silent Slaughter. Now, I was a part of that research and documentation project. I didn't necessarily understand the geopolitical importance of that project or what that project was going to be used for. The report was presented to the then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and to the then Vice President Mike Pence. So if you recall, shortly before Pompeo left office, one of the very last decisions he took was to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. That was a direct result of that report. And then obviously Anthony Blinken came in, Joe Biden came in, and one of Anthony Blinken's first decisions was to take Nigeria off that list. Now, so that's the second thing that happened. Now, the third thing, which is what is going on now, is that the US is obviously in the middle of its trade war with China. China controls an estimated 70% of the world's rare earth minerals. And I think we all know that rare earths basically hold the key to future military and economic domination. And as we also may be aware, the US recently has executed a sort of pivot in its geopolitical strategy. So it's pivoting more toward the Western Hemisphere, so toward the Caribbean and Latin America and parts of Africa, which is traditionally has been able to dominate while ceding like East Asia and other places to China, because the world is reverting into a multipolar model. So everyone has their spheres of influence, and the US is trying to maintain its own sphere of influence, which will then be used to ensure that China doesn't overtake the US. And unfortunately, as part of this strategy, it just so happens that Nigeria and West Africa have been identified as one of the places in the world that have these rare earth minerals in abundance. These rare earth minerals are cheaply available, and there is not much in the way of local industry that is actually using them. And there's also very little or relatively little local defense capacity to stop anyone from coming in and taking them. So putting these three pieces of information together, what you basically have is a situation where, just like in Iraq or in Venezuela or in Libya or in many places where this has happened before, the people who think of themselves as those who rule the planet have taken a look at this place and have realized that, hey, this place has something that we want, something that we need, and there's really nothing stopping us from taking it. All we need to do is come up with a pretext to take it. So why don't we do that? So these people who 2 weeks ago probably couldn't point out Nigeria on the map have suddenly realized that there's violence against Nigerian Christians, that there's a genocide against Nigerian Christians. First of all, there is a genocide in Nigeria, but to describe it as a genocide against Nigerian Christians is to miss the point spectacularly, because it is genocide against Nigerians, right? What the areas that are being attacked all have in common, both Christian and Muslims, that those are places that happen to sit on some of the richest reserves of these minerals that everybody wants. So whether you're a Christian or you're Muslim or you're animist or African traditional religion, whatever you are, if you happen to sit on these rich deposits, they want you off. And it just so happens that these Islamists, who supposedly are chasing an Islamic caliphate, or whatever it is they claim to be pursuing, have a very interesting habit of targeting only those areas. So basically, they're wiping out entire communities, clearing out entire communities, and people aren't able to come back home. And then those communities, those places that used to be communities where people live, have basically turned into giant strip mines. And nobody really seems to know who is responsible for this, how these minerals are getting mined, how they're getting taken out, who is providing the logistical support for that. There's a whole black economy in Nigeria's north that we are just not aware of. There are planes flying with their transponders turned off, which is a thing that also happens in eastern DR Congo. That happens in Nigeria too. So basically, we essentially have an ungoverned space in Nigeria, which happens to be rich in these minerals. And certain actors, like I guess Ted Cruz, Eric Prince, the usual neoconservative gang, the war hawks, have taken a look at this situation and decided, you know what, currently this is a free-for-all. Everyone is getting something out of this. We want to lock this up for ourselves, right? This is the so-called geological scandal, the African geological scandal, and we want to control it. We don't have to share this with anyone. We can just take it, and who's going to stop us? So that's what's actually going on here. And unfortunately, if you're not familiar with the geopolitics surrounding this, you might actually think that this is somehow about some conflict between some group of people somewhere in darkest Africa. I can assure you that half of the people making these comments and beating these drums of war, trying to create this pretext, probably up till now cannot point out Nigeria on the map. Probably don't know where it is. If you were to ask them what is Nigeria's capital, they probably couldn't tell you, because they really couldn't care less. There is simply a geopolitical calculation and an economic calculation that has been made, the same as the one that was made in Iraq and in Libya and in other places, that there is something we want here. If there's not oil, as was the case in Iraq or Libya or Venezuela, then it's gold. If it's not that, there's always something. And it just so happens that Nigeria has all of those things. It has oil, it has gold, it has rare earths, it has everything. It has things that we in Nigeria are not even aware of, but they are. So unfortunately, we could be looking at a situation where this manufactured pretext, if as you said, they get their way, we could be looking at a situation where Nigeria becomes, I guess, the African Iraq. And something else, I guess the fourth data point that sort of brings this all together really nicely is, where do you think the world's largest US consulate is being constructed? The world's largest, larger than the one in Baghdad, larger than the one in London. It's being constructed in Lagos, Nigeria.
Yeah.
So that clearly tells you that there is, even before this administration came into office, there's been a sort of multi-year strategy to pivot toward Nigeria, because clearly Nigeria has something that the US government wants, and the US government wishes to dominate Nigeria as part of its sphere of influence, which is, I guess, not good news for us at all. So, but that's the situation that we're facing.
It's not good news for anyone. Even Americans, it's not good news for, because what do we get out of this? We get another endless war where people are going to get sent to die, and it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and Eric Prince is going to get billions more dollars, and it's just it's the same old cycle. I was just talking to one of our comrades from Syria earlier, and it's the same story. It's like you have these suspiciously well-connected Al-Qaeda terrorists that take over the northeast of Syria years ago, and it's the oil-rich region, it's the wheat-rich region, it's where they have all of their carbohydrates, agriculture, and whatnot.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda, these Islamists, they take it over, and seemingly they are only really concerned about taking that portion of Syria over for an extended period of time. Eventually, they move into the rest of the country, but they committed horrific crimes there against religious minorities, and they exploited all the resources. And who benefited from it? It was the people backing the Islamists. So I do have a question, though. So there's this claim that keeps being repeated. You brought up the excellent point that there's actually been more Muslims targeted by Boko Haram and other affiliated groups. Disproportionately, Christians have been targeted. You mentioned they keep putting out the number 7,000 Christians genocided. Now, they don't give us any sort of time frame as to when this alleged 7,000 Christians have been killed. I've seen some videos of attacks purporting to show Christian churches being stormed, presumably by these Islamist extremists. But do you have any exact figures? Do we have any exact figures on how many people are being killed by these extremists and over what period of time?
Well, first of all, this that number, I think 7,000 Christians a day, is completely pulled out of someone's backside. There's no backing for it whatsoever. And I can say this with some authority because I actually worked on the documentation project where we didn't sort of comprehensively document all Christians who had died, but based on what we had, we were able to extrapolate that over the course of, I think this report covered 10 years. I think over the course of 10 years, it was estimated that as many as, I think it was 20 something thousand Christians, I think it was, according to the report. I stand to be corrected, so feel free to fact check this, but that was what was projected by the report, which, don't get me wrong, is still way too many, and that is an incomprehensible human tragedy, and that is something that illustrates the incredible failure of the Nigerian government, and something definitely needs to be done. Something decisive definitely needs to be done about this, right? However, we have seen this before. We saw this with the so-called October 7 thing, where in the immediate aftermath, we started hearing, oh my God, all sorts of stories. Babies were being incinerated and all of those things. And then over the coming few months, we then got to find out that a lot of it was just entirely false. It just wasn't true. We heard this at the start of the first Iraq war, the first Gulf War, where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador famously went on TV crying that Saddam's revolutionary guards went around picking babies out of incubators and stabbing them with bayonets, and it was this huge emotional event, and it was completely false. He was coached to say that, and that came out eventually. So we've seen these characters pull these stunts before. where there is an atrocity that has been committed, but maybe they feel like this atrocity isn't strong enough to justify what we are trying to do. So we need to exaggerate it. We need to turn it into something that it categorically is not. We need to characterize it as something that it is not. So in this case, you have these supposed Islamists who, for some very interesting reasons, have killed more Muslims than Christians in total, right? Even though they claim to be Islamists, right? And it just so happens that their pattern of killing doesn't follow any statistical model except where there happens to be resource deposits, right? Which is very interesting for Islamists. And then it also happens that these supposed Islamists, where their supply chains are tracked, it always very strangely seems to lead back to a source from outside of the country, right? In some cases, we've seen several instances where villagers who live close to these areas have reported that helicopters piloted by white men have dropped supplies for these Islamists, right? So I'll leave you to think about the obvious implications of that. So first of all, are these even Islamists, or are they in fact somebody's proxy army under the guise of Islamism, right? And is it a proxy army whose job is to destabilize a region for the sake of making it for the sake of making its resources more exploitable? Because we've seen that happen so many other times. So to avoid having those real conversations, some of them pulls a number out of his ass and says, 7,000 Christians are being killed every day, which sounds like an absolutely unconscionable thing, right? Because that would be a tragedy to eclipse, I guess, even Gaza, right? Meanwhile, you and I know that the primary human catastrophes taking place on Earth right now are taking place in Sudan, they're taking place in Gaza, they're taking place in DR Congo, not in Nigeria, which is not to say that a human tragedy isn't taking place in Nigeria on some level. But to then characterize it as that, to then put it in that bracket for the purpose of trying to justify foreign military intervention, I think that really just says it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the death statistics from the report you presented are horrifying. There's no doubt about it, but it's not what Ted Cruz and Eric Prince and all these Zionists are trying to make it out to be. And I'm just seeing it day after day after day, post after post. They're just flooding. And I think it's twofold. I think part of it is the minerals. I think part of it is like, well, Gaza is not the real tragedy. This is the real tragedy. They're killing two birds with one stone. Exactly. But in reality, the actual numbers probably pale in comparison to the violence in Chicago, Illinois on any given weekday night. It's very, very violent in the United States. It's horrifying.
And it's also very telling that at no point in all of these conversations is the real solution to this issue ever discussed, which is that the capacity of the Nigerian military needs to be strengthened. That is never put on the table. Instead, you have Eric Prince talking about flying in his private army to protect Christians who happen to sit on the resources that he and his friends want, right?
Well, because
meanwhile,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, go ahead. I was saying, meanwhile, this is clearly a capacity issue that the Nigerian military. Then, first of all, Nigeria is having its sovereignty violated by a non-state actor that has the ability to cause widespread devastation. So how can the solution to the country having its sovereignty violated be to have its sovereignty violated even further, right? No one is talking about equipping the Nigerian military to have the capacity that needs to be had. Very interestingly, when these patterns of like large-scale violence started to happen around 2013, 2014, the administration that was in power then in Nigeria actually tried to buy weapons. And the US government blocked sales of weapons to Nigeria under the so-called Leahy Law. The US government claimed that the human rights of the people who were presumed to be terrorists were being violated. The US government said that, and the US government not only refused to sell arms to Nigeria, the US government actually imposed a de facto arms embargo on Nigeria, preventing Nigeria from actually purchasing arms from the international market. So Nigeria was reduced to smuggling arms using the international black market, which is why, if you recall, well, you may not have come across this, but if you Google this, you'll see it. Sometime in 2014, a private jet was stopped in South Africa after having intelligence provided from Washington, obviously. And it was a bunch of arms and ammunition on board, and the jet was bound for Nigeria. Those are counterterrorism weapons being smuggled in by the Nigerian government because the US government was preventing the Nigerian government from accessing arms to fight terrorists. And eventually, when the Nigerian government found, I guess, a left field solution, hired mercenaries, South African mercenaries, the group was called the Executive Outcomes, run by a fellow you might know called Ibn Barlow. And that group recorded incredible success, and Boko Haram was on the verge of being, extinguished as a going concern. And then the government lost the election, and then a new government came in, which was obviously, a US puppet government. One of the very first decisions made by that government under US instructions was to terminate that mercenary contract. And as soon as that contract was terminated, Boko Haram returned in full force. And before all of this happened, when Boko Haram first became known to the world, Nigeria spent years appealing to Washington for this group to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And the US State Department under Hillary Clinton spent 3 years stonewalling the Nigerian government and saying, no, they're not going to designate Boko Haram, which is now recognized as one of the world's deadliest terror entities, as a foreign terror organization. So why is it that the US government that refused to recognize terrorists as terrorists and spent 3 years sitting on its hands intentionally, those same people and people from that establishment suddenly care so much about what these very people whom they aided and abetted every step of the way may or may not be doing to Nigerian Christians, supposedly? Why do they care now? Except, it becomes very evident. Of course they never cared. Of course this is all a production for the sake of a geopolitical move, which is to seize resources from a weak African state. That is what this is all about.
I have a question. I know we're talking about different regions here, but are Boko Haram and the other affiliated groups, are these groups in any way, shape, or form, from what we know, ideologically linked or possibly even funded or armed by the same quote-unquote Islamist groups that are trying to cause terror in the revolutionary countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger?
They absolutely are. It's the same umbrella. So it's Boko Haram, it's ISWAP, it's JNIM, it's Ansaru. It's the same umbrella. In fact,
this is all a U.S. operation. 100%.
Exactly. That's basically what it is.
Well, it also explains why, because if Nigeria had a strong military, maybe you would have, one of these very young, charismatic, brave, strong leaders rise up and say, we don't want a U.S.
Absolutely.
We don't want a Tinubu, and also, if you have a strong government, even if they are or a strong military, if they're fighting Boko Haram and they defeat them, like the South African contractors were doing, well, then it's still going to be difficult for the U.S. to exploit those resources when they want to come in to just steal them. Wow. Well, this is, like I said, before we started, I really didn't know all the details with this story, but given that these are the same people fighting in the Sahel, given that, they're targeting the, mineral dense regions, given the fact that the statistics are just pulled out of people's asses and that it's all the war criminals, it's all the pro-Ukraine, pro-Zionist people, I'm really not surprised by any of this. So as a final question to you, we know that the Tinubu government, they're just not only U.S. pawns, but extremely, morally deranged. This guy was, as I understand from your reporting, he was something of a cocaine trafficker in the United. He participated in some cocaine trafficking or something as well when he was younger. Extremely corrupt. What are the odds that you think they will encourage this idea of some U.S. contractors like Eric Prince's Blackwater Reimagined group coming in and actually doing this?
Well, they're probably not going to actively encourage it. There are people who have been in the media, have been, putting out these generic messaging. Oh, it's an internal problem and it should be treated as an internal problem, yada yada. But there's no real conviction behind the message because they know very well that the only reason they're in power is that these same people are the ones who put them there. So there's no real teeth behind that messaging. It's just generic word salad. So I think what is more likely to happen is if the US or the people in charge of the US decide to activate the Venezuela strategy, which is basically tell a lie long enough and put real military muscle behind the lie, which is what they're currently doing because they're claiming that Venezuela is fighting it's using drugs as a weapon of war against them, and they're blowing up random Venezuelan boats, trying to provoke a reaction such that when the reaction happens, they will then carry out a full-scale invasion of Venezuela. So if that same strategy is what is going to be activated in Nigeria, I don't think a Tinubu government is going to be able to do anything about it. I think they're going to pretend that there's going to be some shadow boxing, but they're not really going to do anything about it because these are the same people keeping them in power. Without U.S. government support, Tinubu would not be president. He wouldn't have made it 3 months without U.S. government support. So he's not even a dictator of Nigeria because he doesn't even have control of Nigeria as such. He's being propped up, and he's being propped up in ways you wouldn't even imagine. It's being propped up in ways like, for example, the presidential car, right, which historically has always been a Mercedes-Benz Maybach for decades. As soon as this guy became president, it became a Cadillac Escalade, which was flown in on a U.S. Air Force Hercules C-300. So you can see where I'm going with this, right? This guy, his very life is being protected by the CIA. So if they should so decide, there's really nothing he's going to do about it. So, I think it's actually up. If there's going to be any hope of stopping this sort of thing from happening, it has to come from the generality of Nigerians. There has to be widespread opposition to any such idea of foreign military deployment on Nigerian soil. Nigerians need to understand why that is a terrible idea, especially being that we're only 2 borders away from Libya, which obviously has had this experience before. That's what I hope people are going to clock finally. My hope is not is not with the Tinubu government. They're not going to be useful in any way. They never have been. They never will be.
David Hundeyin, thank you so much. Excellent reporting and analysis as always. And Nigeria should be very, very, very lucky and thankful to have you as a voice representing their country, because the lies will never end and the attempts to exploit Africa will never end either. So thank you so much. I encourage everyone to follow what is your Twitter account again? If you could shout it out.
It's my name. It's at David Hundeyin.
Very good. And is there anywhere else people should check out to follow along to stay up to date with your reporting?
So you can follow West Africa Weekly. You can also follow me on Instagram. It's also my name at David Hundeyin, where I post some of my visual reports.
Very good. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.